Hello, welcome back. Just this afternoon I want to briefly look at a couple of icons from the council, appearing to depict the council, and then we'll have a slightly closer look at the text of the Creed and one or two of the more interesting canons that the Council of Nicaea put out. Excuse me. The icon that I put up just at the end of the talk this morning is meant to depict the council fathers. You'll see that the figure there in red is depicting the emperor, and interestingly and slightly anachronistic, apparently individual wearing a papal tiara. The Pope wasn't present at the council, although he did send a couple of legates to it. It's quite interesting here, and you have to remember that there are no contemporary images of the council. So everything is a later interpretation, a later understanding. And so here, this particular one showing the fathers, it's noticeable that they all have halos. They all have the nimbus, so they are all the holy fathers of the council. There's only one image in this entire picture of an individual who does not have a halo, and that's the poor little chap down in the bottom who is looking fairly miserable and unhappy, and that is a depiction of Arius, who at the end of the council was banished for his views, even though his views did revive later. And there is one particular legend that says that his bowel was burst open after the council as a punishment. It probably didn't actually happen, but certainly there was an attempt in later iconography on the winning side, shall we say, of orthodoxy to depict Arius in this very subservient, very low position. And of course, the background he has is much darker. So it's one way of interpreting. But you'll also notice in this particular icon, and it's not the case in every icon, that the emperor is not seated in the centre. You will actually find icons supposedly depicting the Council of Nicaea where the emperor is seen to be presiding. He opened the council. It was structured in the way that the Roman Senate would normally be conducting its business, but the emperor himself didn't preside. It was probably presided over by a Spanish deacon called Osios or Hosius of Cordoba, who kept proceedings going along. The other type of icon you will come across quite often is individuals from the council who are then depicted holding the text of the Creed. Now this is entitled The Synod of the Holy Fathers. And in the centre we have Constantine. To his right, with the distinctive forked beard, we have Athanasius, who is depicted here as a bishop. Now, Athanasius wasn't a bishop at the Council of Nicaea. He became a bishop as Patriarch of Alexandria only later. And at the council, he was a young deacon. He probably didn't even have a beard. He wouldn't have been able to grow one quite as splendid as that, and other fathers of the council. So this purports to be an image of the Holy Fathers of the council, including, of course, Constantine, who is again depicted with a halo. But the text that they're holding is not the creed from the Council of Nicaea in 325, but the text of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed of 381. If you look at it in something, and it's not the whole text, it actually only has the first half of the text. But they're standing there, they're holding it. And again, this is where you have to be quite careful with iconography, because this particular image has quite wide currency at the moment, and it seems that many of the talks and events that are being held in this year use this particular icon, and it's an icon that relates to the celebration of the triumph of orthodoxy, which is around actually a later council when the prohibition against images was being discussed, and it was felt that by some in the East that the use of images, the use of icons was idolatrous. And in the end, the Orthodox view that actually the images are not idolatrous, but that they are a means of contact with the saints, and particularly with the Lord. So the triumph of orthodoxy is seen as being the outcome of a later council, but this icon is associated with it. And of course, it's a way that all the councils want to link themselves back to that first council in 325. So it's actually quite important. I think it's actually also useful to look at the text of the Creed. We skipped over it in the talk earlier. And this is the Creed of the council. And you'll see there are familiar phrases that are already coming out. God from God, light from light, true God from true God. These date back there. And they come from contemporary writers. These phrases were deliberately pulled together to give a sense of the equality of the Father and the Son, the divine nature of the Son. And it concentrates very much here, if you look at it, the first three clauses relate very clearly to one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible. Then there's a load on the Son, because it was the nature of the Son, the nature of the Son's relationship to the Father that was in contention, and then the final clause, and in the Holy Spirit. Because at this particular point, the great debate was over the nature of the Son to the Father and their relationship. And but later on, there were questions being raised about, there is an understanding that God is Trinity in unity. How then does that relate? How does the Holy Spirit then relate to the Father and to the Son? And it was generally felt at the time that to state that the Father, that the Spirit proceeds from the Father, was very much in line with scriptural texts, where Christ says that he will ask the Father to send a helper, a comforter, a paraclete, to use the Greek term. And so we have this sense that this reflects the scriptural text of the Father sending the Spirit. But then the question is whether the Spirit is, if you like, a created thing, or whether the Spirit is perhaps himself God, and himself in a sense divine, or and shares that divine nature. So someone as involved with the discussions around the divinity of the Son as Athanasius did also say that it was correct and appropriate to use the term homoousios, of the same substance, of the Spirit, and it was as correct to use that of the Spirit as it was to use it of the Son. So our later creed, when the thoughts on the Spirit were being clarified, because it had a bearing on the nature of the Trinity, by the time we get to 381, we have this text. Now, the translation I've used here is actually a translation from the third edition of the Roman Missal, and the sections that are highlighted in green are the bits that were added by the Council of Constantinople. So the Nicaea is in turquoise and Constantinople is in green. And you'll see how various clauses were added, both to the section on the Son. I mean, the Creed has a much larger section on the second person of the Trinity than it does on either the Father or the Spirit. And you'll see that there was no real need for the Church to clarify belief in one God as Father, as maker of all things, other than to add that little bit about maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. The rest of the clarification is expanding the idea around the Son, but at the heart of it you still have the idea that the Son is begotten, not made, who is consubstantial of this one substance, so that you can say that the Son is a distinct person, but in nature is divine, and each of the three persons of the Trinity share in that nature, not in any sense of division, but they each have that nature. And that's what consubstantial at the heart of it means. And as I say, Athanasius was quite happy to apply the term consubstantial to the relationship of the Holy Spirit to the Father and the Son. And so, but we have a much greater development of the idea of the Holy Spirit, as just as ideas around the Trinity were being clarified and developed. And so we hear about the Spirit who proceeds from the Father, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified, so very much emphasizing the divine nature of the Holy Spirit, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified, who's spoken through the prophets. And then we have a few remaining clauses which are actually quite pertinent. We see, for example, coming up in 381 for the first time, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So underlining the fact that the Church is one, which and a fundamental mark or characteristic of the Church is its unity. And I think we only have to look around today, as we only had to look around for the last millennium and a half, if not more, to see that the fundamental characteristic of the way the Church actually operates in the world is in disunity. But a characteristic of the Church is its oneness, and this is why Second Vatican Council and onwards particularly emphasise the importance of striving for, praying for, and working for unity, to the extent that Pope Benedict, a number of years ago, set off some conversations with the Orthodox to discuss what do they mean when they say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father, and how does that compare with what we mean when we say the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and actually came to a position where, in fact, we're saying pretty much the same thing. But there is still that question that, can you actually change the words of the Creed of an ecumenical council without holding an ecumenical council? Because we still have other points of difference between ourselves, we're still not at the point of them completely coming on board. So if we look at the Creed that's used in the West, in our liturgy, you'll notice that there are some subtle changes. We have the Filioque, the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. But you'll also notice, if perhaps you hadn't spotted it before, and if I move it to and fro, the creeds that I've been putting up all begin with the first person plural. There is a profession of faith of the Fathers of the Council. So we believe in one God, we believe in the Holy Spirit. Whereas the creed that we use during our liturgy now has the first person singular, I believe. Those of you who will recall, in the translation that we used at an earlier stage of the Nicene Creed, actually used the plural, because the original creed was a joint statement of faith of all those present. Whereas this has really taken on the nature, if you like, of a kind of baptismal creed. If we think about the Apostles' Creed that we sometimes say at Mass, it is very much a personal creed. It's a baptismal creed. It was used for the individual's profession of faith before receiving baptism. So that I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ. It's a personal profession of faith. Whereas for the councils, it was a combined profession. We, implicitly, we all, the undersigned, believe. When we use it in our liturgy, we have now reverted to using the first person singular. So you need to be aware of that. There's a subtlety about that, in that it emphasises, rather than the community professing its faith as one, it emphasises the other aspect of a community of individuals, each of whom personally professes this faith. Neither is right, neither is wrong. They're just two different ways of looking at it, and I think you need to bear that in mind. So there were a couple of other things that I thought perhaps might be just quite interesting to pick up from the deliberations of the Council, if we move on from the Creed, however central that is to it. I mentioned that the Council passed 20 canons or laws, which then made their way into the imperial canon of law. And I'd just like to sort of talk a little bit about two of them. Some of them are disciplinary, some of them were around how do you deal with individuals who've gone away from the church, how do you reconcile them? Are there individuals who cannot be reconciled? Do they need to be rebaptized? And it was clear, no, you don't. baptize again. And there were individuals who said, well, if you commit a really serious sin after baptism, then that cannot be forgiven. Which is why there was a practice which was actually quite common of individuals who were in the process of entering the church, who'd become catechumens, and so were in the final stage of preparation before baptism, of deferring baptism until the deathbed. Because baptism wipes away every sin that has been committed up to that point in your life, regardless of how awful a sin it is. Baptism wipes that away. Now, it's a bit high risk, because if you die with those sins on your conscience and you haven't been baptized, you are in eternal trouble, it has to be said. So it's a bit high risk. But interestingly, the emperor who called the Council of Nicaea, who very much promoted Christianity, who supported Christianity, was not baptized until his deathbed. Constantine was, for most of his life, a catechumen. There's also a very interesting question as to who baptized Constantine. Was it an Orthodox priest or bishop, or was it, as some sources suggest, an Arian priest who baptized Constantine on his deathbed? Then you have the whole question that we haven't got time to go into today about the validity of the sacraments of those who are separated from us. And I think this is something which is really important when we think about our dealings with, particularly with the great churches of the East that are separated from us, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the churches of the East, where we disagree on some fundamental matters of doctrine. But ultimately, the sticking point between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church is over that one clause in the Creed, filioque, and the Son, whether the Spirit proceeds from the Father or the Father and the Son. And it goes back to not whether the Spirit actually proceeds from the Father and the Son or not, but whether you can change a creed without having a council. In the East they say no, in the West they say yes. And the reason that the West would say yes is because in the East the Roman Empire in one form or another continued until 1453 and the fall of Constantinople, whereas in the West, by about the sort of 5th, 6th century, the power base, the secular power base, had become the papacy. And so papal authority, which probably reached its peak under Innocent III at the beginning of the 13th century, end of the 12th century, beginning of the... Yes, I'm sorry, it's because I was trying to remember. Yes. This is what happens when you write that. Round about the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th, Innocent III, where you have the pinnacle of papal power, where and this then begins to decline, but it declines. It's the secular power rather than the spiritual power that declines, to the point where you get to the 19th century and the temporal power of the papacy, because you have to remember that the Pope in the West was also a secular ruler as well as a spiritual ruler. That there were since about the 5th century, the Pope had ruled what were called the Papal States, which were originally gifted to the papacy in order to provide a means of feeding the people of Rome, because up to that point it was the Roman emperors whose responsibility it was to ensure that the people of Rome didn't starve. When the Roman emperors were no longer in office, then the papacy took that over. And it really comes to a point where it's growing under people like Gregory the Great. You also find popes who have a role in defending Rome. Pope Leo the Great, Leo I, who negotiated with the Vandals when they invaded in the 5th century that they wouldn't sack Rome. There's probably a whole new talk about popes called Leo. There are some fascinating popes. We won't go there at the moment. But it is quite a useful thing to remember that the division that we have is still one which rests around a very small but very, very important doctrinal issue. But the big question is how do we resolve that? Other canons that it dealt with, two that I particularly enjoy. One is Canon 20, the last one, which interestingly reflects a different liturgical practice. Since there are some, it says, who kneel on Sunday and during the season of Pentecost, this Holy Synod decrees that so that the same observances may be maintained in every diocese, one should offer one's prayers to the Lord standing. So, on Sundays and throughout Pentecost, throughout the season between Easter and Pentecost, when you are at church and praying, you should not kneel down at all, according to the Council of Nicaea. That has fallen out of use. There is a general tendency in the West for kneeling to have taken a much firmer, much greater place in the liturgy. Whereas in the East, you will find that people will stand throughout the Divine Liturgy, those who can. There was a lot more standing that went on in churches, even in the West. And pews really didn't start appearing in churches until after the Reformation for people to sit on. So you had basically an open floor. People would either stand or they'd kneel on the floor. Those who were unable to stand for that period of time, there'd be little ledges all the way around the side of the church. Hence the statement, the weak will go to the wall. And that's where it came from. But it is interesting that although we no longer conform with that particular practice, if during our liturgy we have the Litany of the Saints, let's say it's an ordination, if the ordination takes place on a weekday, then the litany is recited with everyone kneeling. But if the ordination takes place on a Sunday, and this caught me out once when I was deacon at a diaconal ordination, if it takes place on a Sunday, we stand during the litany. So there is still that, if you like, echo from Nicaea in our liturgy today. And the other one that I did want to mention, which I mentioned very briefly, is that the council put deacons firmly in their place. As a deacon myself, I know my place. Father Adrian will know that I know my place. Whether I act on that knowledge, of course, is not for me to judge. But there had been instances where, you see, the first deacons were very much meant to assist the bishop, particularly in matters of administration. Deacons didn't have a huge role within pastoral work and evangelisation, although some were active in pastoral work. But there had come a point where some of the deacons were getting a bit above themselves. And of course, by this point, bishops were appointing presbyters, we would call priests, who would represent them and actually be running areas outside the main centres of the city of the diocese, which evolved into what we call the parish. But it was found when all the clergy were coming together, the deacons were receiving communion before the priests, even though it was the priests who, in concelebrating, had actually offered that sacrifice. The deacons assisted at the offering of the sacrifice. But also that within the church there were certain places set aside for, there was the bishop's throne. He would have his own deacons either side, who was his assistants, but then any other deacons present had to sit in a separate place and not along with the presbyters. And there was a situation, and situations kept arising where the deacons were bumping the priests out of the way and said, no, I'm going to sit here, I'm more important than you are. And the council stamps on that very carefully. Deacons must remain within their own limits, knowing that they are the ministers of the bishop and subordinate to the presbyters. So there is this sense in which the council also clarified the church's understanding of the hierarchical nature of its ministry. And that's something that stayed with us. So when the diaconate, for example, ceased to exist in any real sense as a distinct ministry and was revived by the Second Vatican Council, we've had the last 60 years to try and work out what is the diaconate and what does the deacon do. And in the first 60 years, we've spent the focus on what does a deacon do. And now we're beginning to think about, but yes, what is a deacon? And how do we understand that ministry? But there is, and we have to go back to Nicaea to understand the place of the diaconate within the church's ministry, particularly the threefold ministry of bishop, priest and deacon. And I think that rather draws me nicely and neatly to a close by simply admitting that I know my place. And I also know that time is moving on, so I think thank you very much for listening. I hope there have been one or two interesting things that you've picked up today, and I'll draw it to a close by saying thank you and goodbye.